ओम नमः श्री यतिराजाय विवेकानंद सूरये सच्चित सुख स्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे. We will recapitulate what we discussed in the 16th and 17th sutras of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, because quite a few people had asked some questions about the topics which were covered in these two sutras, 16 and 17. So instead of answering them individually, I thought perhaps I should just recapitulate what we discussed, because these two sutras are very important to understand the nature of our soul, the nature, the purpose of our existence. What does samadhi do to you? What does samadhi do to us? And why we should practice yoga, Patanjali's yoga. So yoga means so many things to so many people. Everybody doesn't have the same idea of yoga. And unless the goal of yoga is clear, unless we do that first, then the very purpose of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is not served. Discussing the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra implies that we really know what yoga is and what it does to us, and whether our priorities in life are correct. Because you see, what we discussed earlier also, what we considered to be true, what we considered to be absolutely real for us, it's a very subjective question which we all of us have to answer before we begin the study of a particular subject. Because there is no clarity, we just study subjects, especially spiritual subjects or spirituality or spiritual texts, with the same attitude with which we study our secular subjects like physics, chemistry, and other subjects. We study them. If you ask a student why are you studying these things? Why are you focusing so much? Why are you concentrating so much? He will say it is simple, because I really believe that a study of these subjects will enable me to get a good job and be prosperous and settle down nicely in life. So the purpose and the goal, though it is a temporary goal, is very real for that boy. If he believes in that goal as the most important, if he gives priority to that goal, then you will find all his efforts will be focused in studying properly, in trying to understand physics properly, chemistry properly, or his subject like medicine properly, so that he can become a good doctor. So that is the goal of his life. So whatever we consider to be real and the goal of our life will engage our full attention and concentration and focus. And our attitude will vary according to what we think is the most important thing in life. If we don't think that the method that we use, or the book that we study, or the ideas that we discuss, whether it is reading books or whether it is listening to talks, the first question one should ask oneself is whether I am studying these things or trying to understand these things with the purpose of achieving something which this particular text tells me is the goal. Definitely, when you want to become a physicist, you know to become a physicist is the goal of your life. So anything that involves physics, anything that will enhance your knowledge of physics, anything that will make you more creative and more competitive in the field of physics, you will go after that. It's a very natural tendency if your goal is to become a physicist. So the goal of yoga should be very clear, whether you really want to be a yogi, whether we really want to be a yogi. If that is the goal, then it is very much important to understand where that knowledge will finally lead us. We know the goal of physics though it is limited, will lead us to a place or to a state of life where we will be either a professor or a scientist, or we know that there is a limit to our achievements. Maybe within the 60 years of our life, 60 or 80, whatever we have as a lifespan, but most active portion will be 60. So around 60, where I should be, I would be perhaps be called as one of the most successful physicists in the world. So we know the goal where we have to reach, and what are the stakes involved. What should we try for? How much effort we should put in? All these things will depend on how real the goal is. But for example, say, along with physics, we have so many other hobbies and other pursuits which we think is our goal. We have equal interest in music, for example. So a physicist who also is interested in music as his pastime, or maybe a equal he considers music to be equally real, and music is as much a passion as physics is. So you'll find his goal is now twofold. One is to become a good physicist, and the other thing is to become a good musician. If he has both the achievements as his goal, his or her goal, so that person will strive, divide his time between physics and music, and will try to become as good in music as possible, as much his time permits him. And so also he'll try to excel in music to whatever level he wants to achieve. If possible, he would dream of becoming the best in both, become one of the best in both physics and music. So also if he has some other pursuits, like for example, he would also like to be called as a very noble and good human being, then he will take care of his moral virtues. He will take care that he can help as many people as possible. So along with the tag, or along with the goal of a physicist, as for example, if you see Abdul Kalam, the example I give you, because he was single minded in his pursuit of his goals. It was a secular goal, but no doubt it was a noble goal. So his idea was to do something in space research. So he excelled in whatever field he studied, but at the same time, he was naturally inclined to lead a good life, to become a good human being, to be a teacher. He had his love for children, his love for students, his love for spreading knowledge among the young, empowering the young. So that was another pursuit of his life. So as soon as his career in the field of physics was over, he took up his second pursuit in life, and he followed it meticulously, became the president of India, and also he used to interact even as in his capacity, even after he retired as president of India. After that job was over, he said, basically, I am a teacher. So teacher was his first love, to teach whatever he knew. So we have a lot of intermediate goals in our life, and that makes us, if we stick to the pursuit of those goals, that makes us achieve success in that particular field. But at the same time, we have to decide our priorities. When he decided that he had to be a scientist, he was focusing more time, though his nature as a good human being was being developed simultaneously. It's not that he decided first, let me be a good physicist, then let me focus on teaching and other things. He was a good teacher as well as he was a good scientist. So whatever role he was asked to play, keeping in mind his capacities, his priorities in life, he did well. So also when we follow yoga, Patanjali's yoga, whether we follow yoga or Vedanta or any other philosophy, we have to decide once for all what is the purpose of our studying this Vedanta. If studying yoga is just to tell people that I have passed this, or I have undergone this course, I have studied this Upanishad, that Upanishad. There are a lot of people who say that they have undergone, along with their profession, of course, they have undergone a lot of uh, understanding of different scriptures, of different traditions, depending on what they are interested in. Some people have mastered the Gita, used Gita as a philosophy of their own life, though they were very successful in whatever profession they were. Then some people were interested in yoga. They practiced yoga simultaneously. The physical aspects of yoga, yogasanas, got a good health. So they could go up to asana and pranayama. They excelled in it. They said 2 steps of yoga are enough for us. The first 3 steps are enough for us. We'll lead a good life, a healthy life, a long life, along with our other priorities in life, the pursuits which we think is the goal of our life. And along with that success in that field, we'll have success in this field also. And maybe when they find they have to retire from one field, they take to yoga full time. It becomes a passion in their life. So we'll find a lot of people taking up yoga or Vedanta or any spiritual subject or subjects as a subject of their study or as an object of their study. The object is engaging their attention. The object of their studies to intellectually understand these wonderful philosophies. But it is not necessary that they consider it to be the sole object, or they don't try to understand it subjectively. When I say subjectively, I do not mean as a subject, but in relation to what it does for you. So we have to make our priorities clear. Do we study this subject just as we study physics to make ourselves a good physicist? We play sports to become an excellent sportsman in that particular field. Just as we do that, do we study yoga with the motive that it will subjectively enhance us as not only students of yoga, but as good yogis? Or if we study Vedanta, the study of Vedanta will enable us to become excellent or good Vedantins, that we can transform ourselves subjectively using the objective knowledge which you have. So all the knowledge, including that of Vedas, there is a beautiful Sanskrit aphorism, Tatra Veda Aveda Bhavati. Tatra means when you realize the goal of Vedas, the objective Veda vanishes. You don't need the objective Vedas. It Tatra Veda Aveda, they become irrelevant. What you study becomes irrelevant. What do you mean by that? So to understand that, the verse number 16 which we discussed, Tat Param Purusha Khyate Guna Vaitrishnam. Now, this is the most misunderstood or most feared thing about religion. The highest kind of non-attachment or Vairagya. There were many questions about Vairagya because Vairagya has been understood or explained as something which is so fearful that people do not want their children, especially the parents do not want their children, if they are too much attached to their children, they do not want children to know what Vairagya is. The classic example is that of Bhagwan Buddha. As Siddhartha, his father had a faint idea that somebody would, that in future, he will get an inspiration to become a monk. And in those days, monks, Buddhism, of course, came much later after Buddha. There was this tradition of Hinduism, Vedic, he belonged to the Vedic tradition. So there was some idea of monasticism, though it was strengthened by Buddhism, but there were definitely Shramanas, or those who were wandering in pursuit of the Supreme, of Purusha, of Brahman. So Vedas were inspiring some people, a small section of society, to practice Vairagya with the intention of attaining Brahman or realizing God. So the number was very few. So in general, common people thought that they did not want, those who were involved in the world, they did not want their children, or even as a king, his father did not want Siddhartha. He wanted him to succeed, whatever, become a, take over the his kingdom. Though it was a very small kingdom, he wanted his son to succeed him. So naturally, he was so much afraid of this idea of Vairagya that he saw to it, and he thought Vairagya or detachment, some kind of non-attachment, happens to a person only if he is unhappy or disappointed with life. This is a very, very wrong idea. Though sometimes any kind of mishap or any kind of setback in life may lead to Vairagya, as it really happened in Buddha's case, but it is not necessary. Ramachandra, if you see the life of Sri Rama, he was born when, if you see the Yoga Vasishta, where he was a student of Vasishta, though he went to Vanavas and many things, that was not responsible for his Vairagya right from beginning. Rama or his father-in-law King Janaka, they were all born with the spirit of Vairagya. So there was no need for them to learn the importance of Vairagya by getting disillusioned or getting setbacks or suffering in life. Suffering was not necessary always. Just as Buddha, for him, dukkha is a very big motive power for Buddhists to go after nirvana, because they expect, or the Buddhists believe, that to get rid of dukkha is the main goal of life. That is what they think real, because Buddha told them that wherever you go, there will be some kind of dukkha, though it will be coated with some sukha. But ultimately, you have to get rid of the suffering which you have to undergo as a result of your contact with the world. So he explained, and a lot of people, even the rich kings, Ashoka and all, they were inspired by this idea of Vairagya. But the motive for Vairagya was given as dukkha. So without dukkha, one could not appreciate the real value of Vairagya. That's what the Siddhartha's father believed. That's why he surrounded young Siddhartha till he was married and even had a small child. Till that time, he was not exposed to any kind of dukkha in his life, thinking that the little exposure to dukkha will motivate him to look after real peace, real joy, which we get as a result of practicing yoga or following Vedanta or following any religion. Religion promises, any kind of real religion or spirituality promises you eternal peace. But for that, one has to believe what it asks, not only believe blindly, but try to experimentally verify what the scriptures say. And they don't say without any reason. Most of these scriptures, especially the scripture of yoga, Patanjali Yoga says everything can be scientifically practiced, studied, practiced, and verified as a matter of one's own experience. We don't have to just believe and say that because Abhyasa and Vairagya, Abhyasa is repeated practice of controlling one's mind, and Vairagya is indifference or some kind of non-attachment. Not indifference. It is a kind of non-attachment. Why is this non-attachment necessary? So Patanjali gives us a very clear logic. He doesn't say Vairagya is necessary because you have to anticipate dukkha. Today or tomorrow some dukkha will come. And to avoid that, or maybe to overcome or surmount that, you need Vairagya. No, that is not the reason. The reason has to be understood properly. So that is why Tat Param Purusha Khyate Guna Vaitrishnam. This is the 16th verse, which is very important. The translation is, when through the knowledge of Atman or Purusha. Purusha means Atman. The eternal, the Sat Chit and Ananda, the eternal existing reality, the eternal reality which never diminishes, which never gets destroyed, which is always with us, eternal, and with which one can feel one's oneness. One can become one with that reality, and that alone removes all sorrow or joy or the relative existence. So, through the knowledge of that Atman, Purusha Kyatehe, with the knowledge of that, Purusha means in what is Purusha in Sankhya is Atman in Vedanta. So, whether you practice Vedanta or yoga, Purusha Khyate or the knowledge of Atman is supposed to be essential. With that intention in mind, one Guna Vaitrishnam, one develops a kind of non-attachment towards anything that is connected with the change, which is also known given the word Prakriti. Prakrutehe Vaitrishnam. Guna Vaitrishnam means any manifestation of nature as a result of the combination of three gunas. I told you earlier also, the whole nature can be divided into three: Rajas, Tamas, Rajas and Sattva. So one is the force of repulsion, Dvesha. Anything that you don't like, you get repelled by it. Then there is a force of attraction. That is, the force of attraction is known as Raga, Anuraga. So you get attracted to money, just as Thakur got repulsed with the idea of money. So a person may have dvesha for money, the other person may be greedy for money, he may die for money, thinking that it will give him the highest bliss. But Sri Ramakrishna knew that money can be positively evil. So he had a repulsion for money. So Prakriti, nature, is made of these three gunas. Tamas, which is of the nature of extreme darkness, ignorance, or extreme repulsion. Dvesha, you hate, you try to kill people, you try to destroy. That is tamasic lakshana. The tamasic mind will always be negative. He can't see anything positive. He is not positive. He is not proactive. He is always negative. If you tell the glass is half full, he will say, no, it is half empty. The same glass, he has a tendency to see the empty side of the glass. He said, oh, it is half empty. I want full. But he won't see it is half full. So the attitude changes. So raga or attraction towards Prakriti is known as rajas. And sattva is a balance. Now Swami Vivekananda has a person knowing the transient nature of Prakriti is not disturbed by tamas, that is dvesha or repulsion, neither is attracted by the good or attraction or raga. So raga and dvesha, these are the two things which don't move him, which don't disturb him. He takes Prakriti as it is. That is sattva, but still is bound by that. Sattva no doubt gives the joy. So the three guna, trigunyam guna vaitrishnam. So all the three gunas, if you transcend and one ceases to desire anything that is a manifestation of these three gunas, which is part of Prakriti, that is known as the highest kind of detachment. Tat param, that vairagya. Non-attachment, that highest non-attachment is a cessation of any kind of desire for any manifestation of nature, physical or gross. Gross, as we understand, wealth, money, and so many other things that are available as gross achievements or gross things. But there are subtle desires also, that I should have name, I should have fame, I should be recognized, I should be praised by people. They are hidden gifts. They are not apparent gifts. If some people may desire money, but they'll be more happy. They may not desire money, but they may desire that he should be called as a very noble person. That inflates his ego and he becomes happy. Oh, I have got such a wonderful name and fame. He may be poor, but he's happy to have, he has a higher desire. So any manifestation of nature, gross as in money, wealth, property, and all those things, that the lower kind of people are happy with the gross things. They estimate or they consider it a great achievement if they possess gross things. But a slightly higher or a slightly cultured person, though he gives a little importance to wealth, money, and other things, he considers name, fame, a good reputation. He feels that before I die, I should not, if I just die as a wealthy person without any character, it's not good. But if I'm known as a noble person, that is much more valuable for me. So people do so many things to uh, develop themselves, develop some kind of nobility. These are a slightly higher category of human beings. Whereas the lower category of human beings who are very gross, who are full of rajas and tamas, they will be going after the selfish gross pursuits. So a proper evaluation in the hierarchy, Abraham Maslow described that what motivates a person to action. He says there is an hierarchy of needs. So people who are very, very animal-like, for them the hierarchy of needs are very gross. They will be happy with good food. They will be happy with socializing. They will be happy with mixing people, irrespective of how they earn their money. And that is the end of their life. So according to Abraham Maslow, the lowest people are happy with the wealth, the positions, and other things, and with maybe a little name and fame which is associated with that. But as the hierarchy of needs improves, as the human beings graduate from animal level, but we will be surprised to know that this existence at the animal level gives joy to a lot of people. A majority of the people evaluate a human being by his gross achievements. They don't even bother what are his other qualities, what are his human qualities. The human aspect of that his personality is not given so much weightage. And that's why people go after these gross achievements, thinking that is the summum bonum of life. But since a majority of the people in this world have just graduated from animals in evolution, even Darwin agrees with this. So though we don't strictly follow the evolutionary principle of Darwin, Swami Vivekananda says Darwin believed that it is survival of the fittest. That may be true in the animal world. That is why the animal-like people think that if we are fit, then only we can survive. So to survive, they have to be fit. To be fit, they have to be rich, to be wealthy. In fact, some religious movements, I do not want to name them, some religious movements, the founder of that religious movement was, he propounded a strange theory. How do you know that you have the grace of God? I do not want to name that sect for obvious reasons, but they were asked this fundamental question, or he tried to answer that fundamental question. It became a big philosophy. How do you know that you have the grace of God? Now, if you look at the Bible, he clearly says, Jesus says, you cannot have God and mammon at the same time. So the answer is very clear if you go to the fundamental teachings of the Bible. But according to this philosophy, the theological conception which this particular sect propounded, they said if God's grace is upon you, if we want to confirm, because there's no other way. Suppose somebody says, a spiritual person says, I have the grace of God, and he is very poor, and he is a beggar for all, like Saint Francis, and there were so many of Assisi who are voluntarily, who embraced poverty, the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These are the fundamental vows according to the pure form of Christianity, or according to Jesus. So he would expect a true Christian or a person who followed him to be poor, to be obedient, and also to be pure, to be pure, to embrace poverty willingly, without any attachment towards the world. So mammon does not figure in the scheme of Jesus's idea of sadhana or to evolve into a superior human being. But contrary to these ideas, some ideas were propounded where he said, if you want to know, and Jesus also spoke of grace of God. Even in our scriptures, we say the grace of Sri Rama, Sri Krishna, we want the grace of God. What do you mean by grace of God? For most people, grace of God means to, the moment they get some, there's a windfall, they get a lottery or they get a lot of wealth unexpectedly, we just without thinking say, oh, it is the grace of God, as if God has nothing else to do than give you money and all those things. Sri Ramakrishna very clearly said, when people came to offer him 10,000 rupees, he threw it in the mud and the coin, holding them in both hands, and threw them as an example to show that money, taka mati, money and this clod of earth has the same value from the ultimate point of view. So that is what spiritual people believe in. So to understand that kind of vairagya, we have to understand why that kind of vairagya has to be practiced. Because when we raise ourselves to that level, when the gross things of the universe no longer, as opposed to our animal instinct, which says the gross things are important for your survival, we go a little step ahead. And every evolution presupposes less importance given to the gross, more importance given to the subtle. So you find people who have graduated from tamas to rajas and from rajas to sattva, you will find these gunas bring about a change in their personality. They start giving more importance to nobility, to humanity. They start altruistic form of religion. Whereas the sect which propounded a theory that to know if you have the grace of God, that shows that you must prove that you should be wealthy. The grace of God will show the wealthier you are, that means God's grace is upon you. So based on that, a lot of people started believing to be pure is to be sinful. To be pure or to be poor, to not only to be pure, but to be pure is okay, but to be poor is to be sinful. So if one is poor, voluntarily or otherwise, then the grace of God was ruled out. So a theology was also propounded. Even we had that kind of Hindu tradition also in the Charvakas and all. They believed in the superiority of material existence. And that is going to be, a majority of the people will be inspired by this ideal. So we cannot deny that. But that is not evolution according to all the scriptures and all the religions. If one is really evolved, he will go after higher and higher pursuits. So a slightly evolved person or a slightly human person or a slightly noble person will exhibit unselfish attitudes in his life. He will be more and more concerned about others. He will not give that much premium to the gross, though he may not give up the gross altogether, but he will not give a premium to the gross, thinking that is the end all and be all of my existence. He will give more importance to the subtle things and things that takes him towards the spirit, the finer and finer, ultimately reaching the Purusha. So in Prakriti, this kind of gradual evolution from tamas to tamasic, rajas, rajasic, sattva, and then pure sattva. So this gradation in Prakriti, any manifestation of nature, if you are attached to that, you may evolve from your attachment to the tamasic aspect of nature, which takes you to the level of animals, but slightly better human being if there is a mixture of tamas and rajas, because you are going after some noble pursuits. Maybe it's name, fame, want to help others, you want to be considered as a good human being. But if you still go, you don't have any name and fame, you are unselfish, simply you quietly help others and don't make, it doesn't make you egoistic. In that case, you will see that he's Rajasic, but at the same time, he has a little bit of Sattva as well. And a pure Sattvic person will never make a show. His ego is absolutely zero, like that of a child. His ego is very humble. So this non-attachment, guna vaitrishna, this detachment, progressive detachment to the gunas or prakruti, is non-attachment. Vaitrishna. Trishna means desire. So if one does not have too much of desire towards the gross any manifestation of nature or even the subtle, so total non-attachment, the higher you go, you get para vairagya, tat param. So non-attachment is not indifference. That is popularly misunderstood as non-attachment. Vairagya means it is indifference. I should not bother about wealth. King Janaka, Rama, for example, he ruled a kingdom. He ruled it wisely, but he was fully non-attached. Even King Janaka. This idea, this sentence, one has to always remember that non-attachment is non-indifference. We made it very clear in the gospel class that to be indifferent is not the solution. The housemaid in the house of her master serves the children and the master as if they are their own, knowing fully well that her home is somewhere else. So she is not indifferent to her duties. She is as much concerned about doing her duty perfectly because that is her job. Thinking, but at the same time, in the heart of her heart, she is not attached to these people. But she will, for that reason, will not be indifferent. So there is a huge difference between non-attachment and indifference. Vairagya does not mean indifference. That is the first thing to understand. This can many people reject the aims of yoga philosophy as inhuman, as selfish, because they imagine yoga as a cold, or a vairagya means a cold, deliberate shunning of everybody and everything for the working of one's own nirvana. So these people are very selfish. That's the argument given against yoga philosophy, saying that these yogis, they appear to be very selfish because they are avoiding all the attachment, all social, that's nirjanvas or solitude, and all these things are not, do not make them fit to live in society. How can they be indifferent to everybody? How can they be so inhuman? They can so that they avoid company and all those things. And they say, superficially, they say such people are selfish, inhuman. You have no love, and mistake the love for the flesh and for the gross as real love. So we have to understand what real love is if we want to understand what vairagya is. The truth is exactly the opposite. These people are far from unselfish, the yogis. Human love is the highest emotion, and most of us know that love is the highest emotion which motivates. The higher the human being, the greater his love should be. But we have to understand the nature of that love. What is selfish love? What is unselfish love? Human love is definitely the highest emotion which a human being can have. We say, oh, he loves people, he helps them. But it has to free yourself from any tinge of egotism in our relationship with other or more individuals. When somebody says, I love somebody, he is very possessive or egotistically attached to that person. Human love is very possessive and exclusive. I love a thing, I love a person because it gives me joy. I don't care if it gives the other person joy or not, or the other thing joy or not. I like hunting. I like killing animals, even if it means pain to others. I love it because it gives me joy. So hunting is a pastime. Most of the kings and the rich aristocratic people believed in such sports. So if we really love, then your ego with relation to the others should reduce. It should not increase. I should not love a person because that gives me joy. If it is possible for me to love a person, if it gives him joy, not bothering about my own joy and comfort. But very often, love in the world is very selfish. The moment a person does not give us joy, we just reject him. Even the most noblest of people, if you have to undergo a lot of torture or lot of difficulty in serving somebody, and if people think it doesn't give me joy, so you just avoid that. But if it gives you happiness, that's why when you say we are good friends, when the friends are giving you joy, you like their company. But if they have problems, you will see how many friends try to avoid. They will give some excuse or the other, say I'm busy, oh I have this, I really want. There will be some lip sympathy, but very often you find this in the world. When you are socializing, when everybody is happy, when you are able to contribute to the joy of others, you love company, you love their company. But the moment you realize they are in trouble, then you keep a safe distance. This is not love. Human love should not be possessive or exclusive. But love for the Purusha or Atman, that is what yoga says. If you really love the Purusha or the Atman in yourself, then your love will be not temporary but permanent. It will be universal because you will see the same Atman in others. You will not love that person for his or her gross manifestation. You love because of the Atman. So it's a kind of universal love. Why did Sri Ramakrishna love everybody? Why did Jesus love everybody? Why did the prophets love everybody? Because they saw the same Atman shining in everybody. So love for Atman is not possessive. It's not exclusive. We really admit that it is better to love people for what they really are than merely for their beauty, their intelligence, their strength, and their sense of humor or some other quality. There are so many qualities which attracts us to other people. Oh, he gives me joy, such a humorous person. That's why I love him. But if he tells his problems, we will avoid him. That is not love. If we love them for what they really are, not merely for their beauty or their intelligence. Oh, we'd like to surround ourselves with intelligent people, like to surround ourselves with beautiful people. We don't want ugly people. We don't want people with uh, uh, some kind of deformity or some kind of disease. I remember we had a lot of cerebral palsy and autistic children, except for their mothers. Even some of the mothers did not like, but they somehow had to look after their children. But I have seen some doctors taking so much of pain and care and feeling happy with these autistic children. They were not bothered whether these autistic children were giving them trouble, they were not able to understand. It was such a painful thing to look after those autistic children. But we had a team of doctors when we started the activity. We found it so joyful that we felt and they responded. These children, though we think they are not capable of understanding love, they could sense that love, that we were loving them really for what they really are, not because they have beauty, they have intelligence, or they have a strength, or they can contribute something to us. No, they were not able to do any one of these things. In fact, they were far from intelligent, they were far from beautiful, they had absolutely no strength, and absolutely you could see that there was pain on their faces or any other positive quality which will give us joy. There was absolutely nothing of that. But still, some people who had that spiritually kindled in them, they would love these children. They would somehow serve these children. It gave them tremendous sort of inner satisfaction and joy because they were not loving the gross things about these children. They were loving the Atman. Love for the Atman is what really non-attachment means. Vairagya doesn't mean you don't love anybody. It means you love the highest, not the lowest. So, uh, what people really are, if we see in essence, they are the Atman, they are the Purusha. That we have to understand. And then everything else, however beautiful it is all part of Prakriti. And if we run after Prakriti, it is temporary. A person who is most beautiful now will be ugly as he ages, and then people don't care for him. People who place so much of faith in their beauty, in their ability, in their strength, one day when they become old, they see they're not getting the same kind of respect. And if they don't have higher spiritual pursuits, they feel very sad. Some boxers, some sportsmen, when they are fit, people will clap for them. But the moment they retire, even the most noble of teachers and excellent people, they give so much, they have such a big priority in, and they extol their own superiority in their respective field, very narrow fields. Once they retire, they find it is so difficult. People don't come to them anymore because people value their beauty, their intelligence, their strength, and other things, qualities, not themselves. So the same relatives or the same friends who came to you because you possessed something which gave them joy will not come to you when you don't give them. So what people really are, irrespective of their outer gross manifestation, is Atman. And loving the Atman is real Vairagya, and that gives real joy. To love the Atman in ourselves is to love the Atman in everybody, to love the Atman or the Purusha everywhere. Wherever they are in the background of Prakriti, the background of Prakriti is Purusha. If you know that, that is real love, universal love. To love the Atman in ourselves is to love it everywhere, in every object of Prakriti. So it's the Purusha that is the most dear. And that is the essence of our sadhana. When we practice, when we worship the Lord within us, we are trying to worship the Purusha within us. And the more we succeed, the more we go up in the scale of yoga. That is what yoga means, whether it is Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Raj Yoga. It means the same thing. The more you love the Purusha, the more you go towards the Purusha, go inward, worship the God within. So the whole kingdom of God you can find only within, not without. So you see, the Bible teaches the same thing, that the kingdom of God is within. You don't have to search for that. If we think that the kingdom of God is without, outside, then we will not reach that real eternal place of rest, peace, and joy, that Sachidananda. Neither we will realize it within ourselves, nor will we try to see it in other people. The more you see that Sachidananda within, the more you touch, the more you go away from Prakriti, that is Vairagya. And the more you go towards the Purusha. So going towards the east will make you go away from the west. So Vairagya doesn't mean giving up anything. It is just means going away from the gross towards the subtle. So if we love more and we go and get involved in nature more and more, that is taking us towards the gross, and we will not be practicing Vairagya. Vairagya really means just changing the direction of your love. It means going towards the Atman, which is more eternal. And that will make you love all the objects because behind them is the same Atman. So you love them from the level of the Atman, not from the level of their bodies or their abilities to give you happiness. Such a love is too vast to be understood by ordinary minds. And yet, it is simply an infinite deepening and expression of our of the very little love, gross worldly love that we experience. To love someone, even in the usual human manner, is to get a brief glimpse of something within that person which is tremendous, awe-inspiring, and eternal. If we see something eternal in him, if we see some speck of greatness, say for example beauty or richness or some talent, how much we are enamored of that person. We think that person is a great being, but if we try to see the wonderful Satchidananda in that person, as we go deeper and deeper into ourselves, we see other human beings from a different perspective, then it can be a tremendous awe-inspiring and eternal joy, an experience of eternal joy. In our ignorance, we think that this is something unique. Some people are unique, they have certain characteristics. That's why we say this person is unlike anybody else. He's a great sportsman, he's a great human being, he's a great. So we see the external qualities because our perception of the reality within him is clouded. We see him as a limited being possessed of the gunas of Prakriti, which he is manifesting, not knowing that these very gunas will change. The same person with certain gunas will not remain the same after a certain period of time. They are subject to time, space, and causation. These things change rapidly. That is why our object of love changes rapidly. We love certain things today. The child loves the chocolate today. Tomorrow he will love some bigger toy. Then he will throw that, he'll love bigger toys. So we find something unique in the smaller things, in these people, and we love them for that. When that thing vanishes, we don't love that person anymore because our love was limited. Because our perception of the reality, after the perception of reality behind the things on Prakriti was clouded by the external, it is hidden by the external manifestations. The sattva, rajas, and tamas. Tamas is more, clouds us more, rajas clouds us a little less, and sattva clouds us least. That is why we are at, when we are at the level of buddhi, when the mind becomes sattvic, we say we are buddhiman. Our buddhi is strong. Dhiyo yona prachodayatan. Gayatri mantra is a prayer to awaken the dhi so that our buddhi becomes, mind becomes sattvic. So the more sattvic our mind, the cloud of ignorance which is covering reality becomes thinner and thinner. We can see something transparent. We can see that shining divinity within the objects. We don't get caught by the tamas of the objects, like people who run after the gross things of the world do. They are running after the tamas, and that binds them to Prakriti. So Vairagya means binding, removing the bondage slowly by taking up higher and higher pursuits. So whenever perceptions are clouded by the external manifestations of tamas and rajas and not clear as we do when we have more of sattva, the character and the other higher qualities we do not appreciate. Nevertheless, it is still, this human love also gives us an idea that there can be a higher divine love which is waiting for us. We have to purify our minds, then we see the purity, see the world in a different way. Our sattvic minds, wisdom, the dhi that is awakened. It can be awakened through karma yoga, by unselfish work. It can be awakened through bhakti yoga, by prayers, or it can be worshipped through Raj Yoga, through meditation, repetition of the japa. One day we will discuss how this japa awakens the buddhi. What is mantra? What is mantra chaitanya? What does the mantra do? How sound, why sound is important? Even though it is a subtle sound in the mind, we may not have to repeat the mantra loudly. Trying to meditate on the sound, the silent sound behind the mantra also can be very powerful because it is subtle. So how it helps us to purify our personality from the tamas and rajas, the gunas. Guna vaitrishnam, how does it happen? So the infinite love can be, or the greater kind of love which is there within us can be awakened by making our mind more and more sattvic. It is secure. This type of love is eternal, peaceful, calm. It's free from desires. That's why the Bhagavad Gita beautiful gives us before the 17th verse, we'll discuss what Bhagavad Gita says. Apuryamanam achalam pratishtham. I mean, there is a beautiful verse which we discussed, which says water is continually flowing into the ocean, but that doesn't disturb the ocean. So also desires may come in us. If our mind is like a vast ocean, very calm ocean, no matter how many rivers of desires they impinge upon us, but that person, that ocean is not disturbed. His mind is not disturbed. His mind is balanced, sattvic. Neither by rajas or tamas it is disturbed. So that sattvic mind is very near to that high state of samadhi which a yogi tries to attain. The seer knows peace. He knows real peace. He knows peace who has forgotten desire. That is why Bhagavan Buddha said tanha or trishna, Vaitrishna towards the gunas. He considered that to be a very important fact, because if you want peace, you have to live without craving, free from ego, free from pride. Only a person who has given up the gross and also the ego and the pride, which means giving up even the sattva and the other gunas, he can attain to that Vaitrishna. So that is the idea behind verse number 16. So 17, we discussed that, but today I just wanted to clarify. Now, the next verse requires a lot of explanation. I'll take it up in the next Rajoga class. Vitarka vichara ananda asmita anugamat samprajnatah. Samprajnata, what does samprajnatah mean? Concentration upon a single object may reach 4 stages. Vitarka vichara ananda asmita anugamat. By following this, that is, concentration upon a single object may reach 4 stages. One is examination, that is vitarka, trying to analyze what is what. If somebody says this is good, you just don't take the cup and drink it. You find out, you examine it, whether it is good for you, whether it's good for diabetes. You try to analyze it, that is vitarka. And then do some vichara, discriminate whether it is useful for you. First examine it, what it is, try to find out its properties, and then use your buddhi, a slightly higher development of the mind, and then discriminate vichara. Then you make some vichara. Vitarka, vichara. Vitarka means first try to analyze what it is, know what it is, know what this world is, know what prakriti is, know what the 3 gunas are, know what are the different aspects of our personality. Having known that, then you discriminate what gives you more happiness. So you go from level to level. Then ananda, joyful peace, and then asmita, the simple awareness. So these are the increasing hierarchical states of the mind. And if you are, so you use this, not hierarchical, it is a sequence of the thought process which we have to undergo. So to understand this aphorism, vitarka vichara ananda asmita anugamat samprajnata, we have to study the structure of the universe as it is presented by the Vedanta philosophy. Vedanta says, in this universe. So now, first consider the, it's maybe a repetition, but it is worth it. First, let us consider the basic reality. The reality which does not change, our innermost self, is called the Atman. We have seen that. It is known as Atman or Brahman or Purusha. Anything that does not change, the substratum upon which the whole Prakriti, the play of Prakriti is there, that is the first step. When the reality is spoken in its universal aspect, it is known as Brahman. But if you speak of that reality in the individual aspect as the basis of your experience, it is known as Atman. So Atman is equal to Brahman if you consider the whole world. This may sound confusing, but you have to understand this. The difference between Atman and Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi, when they say the Atman is equal to Brahman, because if you reach the Atman inside, you will definitely reach the Brahman, because your Atman and Brahman are not two distinct things. It is only the ego, the body, and the body-mind complex which gives you a feeling of I. So that Atman in its universal aspect is known as Brahman, but in the individual aspect, it is known as Atman. So, if you see the Christian terminology, they will say immanent God and transcendent God. We also make a similar distinction. So, in both Hindu and Christian literature, this paradox of immanent God, that is God who is all pervading, the Ishvara, the creator, the manifester, the destroyer. Though the Christian theology says the God has created this world, the immanent God which is existing, which we see as Prakriti, and the transcendent God which is Purusha, is accepted by all religions. So we will say God is both within and without. We see the same God within, without also, instantly present inside us and outside. The same reality, the same Godhead is seen in its two relations, the two different relations. One is within, one is without. These are described for convenience by two different words. They are not dual. The Atman and Brahman are one, but it is just a matter of explanation. When you talk of individual reality, which is Atman, we talk of the cosmic reality, that is Brahman. So what is this cosmos made of now? If Atman is the eternal pure substratum, what is cosmos made of? We'll just discuss it a little bit and then we'll conclude today. And we will take up this topic again next time, because this is very important to understand the 17th Sutra. So, Prakriti is defined as the power or effect of Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Brahma Shakti Abhed. This we have to understand. There's another concept we have to understand. Shakti of the Tantras or Prakriti of the Sankhya, they say that Shakti is not something separate from Brahman. It is defined as the power or effect of Brahman, which makes the singular, the peaceful, the eternal, the undisturbed, the undivided, beyond time, space, and the transcendental Brahman, which appears as this universe, it is known as Prakriti. So we have to understand the difference between Prakriti and Purusha and how they are united according to Vedanta. Just as Sri Ramakrishna used to explain it in a beautiful way. He says the heat and the fire you cannot separate. The moment fire is there, there is heat. So heat cannot exist apart from the fire, but the heat and its power to burn is something like Prakriti, whereas the fire itself is Purusha, eternal. But the two are eternally inseparable, but at the same time, the latter puts forth and causes the former. I mean, the Prakriti is a manifestation of the Purusha. And as soon as the goal of yoga is to take the help of Prakriti and become united with the Purusha, go to in a reverse process. And in this reverse process, the sadhana helps us. Sadhana is just reversal of the process. Purusha manifesting as Prakriti is one process, the process of creation. And through sadhana, the individual souls unite themselves with the. So this cyclical existence is going on and on. So that is where the mantra comes in. The first manifestation is the sound, as we will discuss it in great detail. In fact, the January-February Vedanta issue, we have discussed the concept of mantra japa and sadhana with relation to Vedas, Vedanta and Tantra. So Tantra gives us another way of approaching Purusha with the help of sound symbol. Sound is the first thing to manifest. As Jesus said, in the beginning was the Word was with God and the Word was God. It's such a significant statement. So also we say Brahman, the Shabda Brahman or Om was the first manifestation of Brahman. From that whole creation came. It is exactly as what the Bible says. In the beginning was the Word, the Shabda. The Shabda doesn't mean the sound. The manifest sound comes later. The original sound, the first manifestation of this Purusha, when it uses the sound to create the whole universe. That is a universally accepted idea. How it is, we'll discuss. So in the next class, there is not much time. So according to Patanjali and Vedanta, there is a minor difference that Purusha and Prakriti are two separate entities. They are eternally real. They are real and eternal, both. Whereas the Vedanta says that Brahman alone is real, Prakriti is an illusion. That's the only difference. But at the same time, Tantra tries to reconcile both, and it uses this idea of Sankhya and uses, instead of Prakriti, uses Shakti. So Purusha could be entirely liberated and isolated from Prakriti. That is what Patanjali says. It is in fact complete in agreement with the goal of Vedanta, which says you have to unite yourself with Brahman. So it's a question of terminology. We'll discuss about it. So why does Brahman cause Prakriti? Why Prakriti is created? Now this is also a very big question. We will see it in the next class. It is a very deep philosophical question, but it has to be understood in a very simple way. We will try to understand. Then it makes our pursuit reasonable. It gives us a purpose to fix our priorities in life. Why should we follow sadhana? Why should we practice yoga or tantras or Vedanta? Just because we want to get hold of something eternal which connects us all, which first connects, it takes us inward, connects us with the real self within us, the Atman. And then we realize the Atman is the Brahman, and then we come to rest, just as all the turbulent rivers end up in the ocean which is symbolic of, which symbolizes peace, which symbolizes tranquility, which symbolizes joy, eternal bliss, eternal existence, eternal consciousness. To attain that is the goal of yoga or Vedanta or the Tantras. And how it is done and why that is the goal, we will discuss in the next class. But that is the essence of the 17 sutras. So if there are some questions, I'll just see if there are some questions. Yeah. How to define noble qualities and unselfish attitude? Is it in Sattva Guna? Yes, obviously. A Sattvic person, the higher he goes, the more Sattvic he is, the more Sattva, the Prakriti means one's nature. So when you say a person is noble, that means he has a noble nature, that's all. How can you distinguish or describe a person as noble? That he has noble qualities. So as the qualities are made of Rajas, Tamas, Rajas and Sattva in the ascending order, the more Sattva there is in a person, the more noble he is. So it is Sattva Guna, yes. He is a balanced person. He is neither hates anybody, he doesn't have dvesha, that is destructive or ignorant, as in tamas, nor is he too much attracted towards raga. He is neutral. That is why what is vairagya is meant. Vairagya sattva enables you to have more and more vairagya and attach yourself to the eternal. So that is a quality of sattva guna. Yeah, you are right. So next is question is, Buddha could not have pursued detachment and still ruled his kingdom like Rama did. So why did he renounce everything and his duties in his pursuit for nirvana? See, it is a question of attitude or personal likes and dislikes. Both are possible. Detachment was there. There is a pravrutti marg and there is a nivrutti marg. So Buddha followed the nivrutti marg. So whether you renounce physically or not, as Buddha renounced the word physically because he found the physical world painful, Rama did not renounce the word physically because he was told by his guru that whether you renounce physically or not, you have to renounce mentally. If you can do that, if you had the confidence to do that, then people like Janaka and Rama did all their duties, but at the same time they were detached. But if one cannot do that, you see, it all depends on what one's priorities in life are. Buddha had a different motive to teach. There was so much of worldliness. Even religion had become, you see, it all also depends on the yuga. It's a yuga dharma. One practices religion according to the needs of the age. When different prophets come, whatever is necessary, that's why you will find a lot of difference between the actions of the different. In Ramayana, the problem was not that of attachment to the world. There were wonderful, noble people. That's why we call it Treta Yuga. It was not Satya Yuga, but just after that, Dwapara, then Treta. So, in these yugas, there was some nobility still there. So, giving up that, it was not as bad as the Kali Yuga. That's why Sri Ramakrishna had to come. Now, in Buddha's case, when Buddha came, there was so much of attachment. Even the religious rituals, there was so much of animal killing because everybody was selfish. They wanted religious rituals to enjoy life. Everybody was becoming worldly. So, a mild kind of vairagya, or I mean, apparently, the gross kind of vairagya would not have helped. People could understand drama because that yuga, it was very easy. We can explain it that way. So, he didn't have a need to show what vairagya was. Just by his actions, people could understand. But when Buddha came, he saw that the disease is so rampant that unless I give up the world, people will misunderstand religion and use religion to become rich, to become as an excuse to become worldly. So he had to perform vairagya and leave the house, leave his wife and child. That was such a great vairagya. One night he decided he will leave everything and went into the forest. So his path was different. It depends on the condition of that age, the people of that age, how far worldliness, because Buddha was born in this Kali Yuga. So naturally, there was more of worldliness. So it required a drastic remedy, as Thakur did. Thakur had to tell very strongly, because he knew the obsession to Kamini and Kanchan is so much that unless you go on repeating it again and again, the effect will not be there. If you repeat once, it would have been enough. In Rama's age, people could perhaps understand. But it also depends on the age, it depends on the situation. So it is the internal vairagya which is more important. Whether they give up the world or not, it is depending on the situation and the particular person, the personality of that person. Okay. The next example is question is, does Patanjali talk about use of mantra to achieve samadhi like in Tantra, or does he speak only of meditation? Patanjali as such does not say, though he says symbols in whichever way, he does not say that there is a verse. We'll come to the sadhana part of it. Just be patient. When we come to the sadhana part, he says abhyasa, repetition of, may not be mantra as such, but repetition of om or repetition of something which enables you to focus the mind. His focus is only on controlling the mind. Whether you do it through mantra or through any other type of meditation, he is not bothered. Patanjali gives a universal practice in Raj Yoga. But the Tantras found that the sound symbol, the idea of mantra was developed because people found it is very easy to catch, because sound is the nearest manifestation of Brahman in Shakti. We will discuss about it in the next class if possible, or better still, if you have it, it will also be available online. The January and February issue, we are a bit late, but it will be available online soon. You see the editorial where based on the explanation which Swami Vivekananda gave, which we discussed in the November-December issue of Vedanta, the importance of the sound symbol. What is Om? What does Om do? But there is a further addition to that in the third part of the editorial, which is how Shabda and how the Bija Mantras, what is the Bija Mantras will come in the next issue, March, April issue. But before that, you can read that. You can read online, or if you have subscribed, you'll get the magazine soon. You can read it. What it means, what is the difference? I mean, I have not discussed about Patanjali there, but what Tantra speaks of, how it can not only help in meditation, but reversing the process, and how you can reach the Shiva as opposed to Shakti. Shiva means Purusha or Brahman, in Tantras. So Shiva and Shakti, how we by through the worship of sound symbol, which is the same as the Ishta on whom you are meditating. So meditating on the Ishta through a sound symbol is a unique discovery of the Tantras, but it has been used in Vedanta also in a different way, and also in the philosophy of Patanjali or yoga philosophy, which is very close to the Sankhya philosophy. Now, does the guru take on board the karma of the initiates? Now, yes, in a very brief way, I'll try to explain why this is said. That in the Tantra tradition, since you are giving a mantra which has come down in a series of gurus, it simply cannot be taken from the books and repeated. Otherwise, everybody would have taken it from any book and repeated all the mantras are available in print now. But it has to come as a sound symbol from somebody who has received it as a sound symbol from somebody who has realized it. So it has to come in a tradition. So it is like handing over, you might have seen, you just give whatever you have to another person. You have to physically give it. You can't say that unless you physically transfer it, you are really not transferring it. So by reading from a book, it is like earning money, and somebody says I'm giving you on paper that you possess that. But unless you really take possession, it doesn't, you don't own it. So also in this, the idea is that the sound is such a precious thing. The power of Brahman or Shiva is encompassed in the sound symbol. It is known as Shabda Brahman. So that Om is the Shabda Brahman, and the consequent bijas and other names associated with that have the capacity to reverse the process of creation, to go back to the source from which we came, from which it came, and the creation was created. So, this is in brief what the Tantra believes. So, now in this case, when the Guru initiates, he is giving something which is very tangible. And the more the disciple practice, the initiated disciple practices, the more service he is doing to the Guru, because it is as if he has given something which he has got as an inheritance from somebody who uh, has done a lot of sadhana, and it has been started by a tradition which has been started by some great prophet. For example, the Krishna mantra, the Rama mantra, there are so many mantras which would have originated, had their origin in some guru in the past. So that is why Guru Paramparagata means that which comes in a succession of full timers. Even when we study in certain universities, you try to find out in which lineage my professor is, or he belongs to somebody, he has learned from some Oxford professor or from a Nobel laureate. Then you feel very proud that you just don't learn from books. You can easily get knowledge from books, but we don't do it. We want to get a direct experience, especially so in spiritual life. May not be so in academic life, but even in academic life, we take so much of care to find out the tradition, whereas he got his degree from. Then we have more faith in him. We know that he can be authentic, he can be responsible, he can, it's a very authentic way of getting knowledge because he has got it from a very authentic person. So you trace the tradition from which he got his secular knowledge. So also in spiritual knowledge. So in spiritual knowledge, now the karma of the disciple. Now that is the question Holy Mother says in many places in the gospel and the lives of the divine. They say if the subtle energy or the subtle power which is associated with the mantra can be given in a gross way, and then it has to be practiced in a very subtle way. That's why we are supposed to repeat the mantra in a subtle way, so that there's not much wastage. I mean, not it does not get dispersed in the gross. So the more subtle, the more mentally you repeat the mantra, the more powerful it is, because it goes towards the source, which is beyond the subtle, which is beyond the causal. So our mantra is the only way that can make us noble human beings, taking us from the gross sound which we got at the time of Diksha and convert it into subtle. It's already been done, and we have to now practice it in a subtle way, so that we one step is already covered, and we go further and further in it. In that process, now the more you repeat, the more subtle, the more the disciple repeats, the better it is for the person who has given you, because it enhances, each of these repetition has a connection to the gross. So it not only helps the person to reduce one's own karma, it also helps the person who is practicing it to make the cosmic karma reduce. So in that sense, the person who is more intimately connected to you is your guru or your teacher. So if the teacher has so unselfishly given you something which can work out your karma, if it it has to be used properly. If it is used properly, that is the greatest service one can do to the guru. That's why in the tantras they say the greatest service is not just giving him some kind of physical service. We can do some gross service, but it really it is lesser. It is less important than practicing the sadhana. The more japa you do, the less you will be affected by your own karma, and by virtue of getting it from a guru, his karma also, if not it, at least it will not worsen. But if for some reason the disciple doesn't do it, then the karma of the disciple has to be to some extent borne by the guru. So there are so many other conditions. It is a very long discussion. That is why the guru has to take on board the karma, some of the karma, not the entire one, not the entire karma. That is why Sri Ramakrishna and they initiated so many people. There were some people who did very well. On one side, there were some disciples who actually, by their sadhana, like Brahmanandi, Swami Vivekananda, he had some good disciples who could balance the counter counterbalance the effect of those who did not do. So also with Holy Mother. Holy Mother used to say, somebody does or not, but they will be the losers as well. The disciples also will be losers, because we should not be responsible by our actions to make somebody else suffer, leave alone our own guru has unselfishly given. So that is the idea. We do not have the right to make others suffer, even our guru bhais and other people with whom we are in touch. So the repetition of japa is the only way you can repay the debt to our ancestors. It's not just the guru. The guru has his guru. So the more I do, I repay the debt of what we got from our own gurus. So it goes in a tradition, and finally it reaches Brahman, the originator of that mantra, the one who gave that mantra, charged it with so much power. So in fact, when we worship God, it's not just the guru, but the guru's guru. Everybody has to take a little portion of the karma of the whole chain. So that is the rule. But since there is an option to work out not only our karma, but the karma of not only the disciples, but also the whole chain, the gross karma, the subtle karma, there are so many levels of karma. So by every repetition, the karma is, we are in a position to reduce the effects of our karma. Effects of our karma means prakriti. So guna vaitrishnam, that is very good question, very relevant to the today's point discussion, that guna vaitrishnam, all the three gunas, even the sattva guna, they cause bondage. And the more vairagya we have, the more abhyasa we will be able to make, and it will make not only our lives but the lives of our guru and his guru and the whole tradition. It enables, it surcharges the power behind the whole tradition, and that is why the more the disciple main contribution is to do the mantra, do the sadhana, whatever sadhana has been given, more and more, so that he can contribute something of his own to that whole chain. So I thank all of you. I'll take your leave now. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.